Hello everyone, and welcome to The Current, the North Central Region Water Network's Speed Networking webinar series. The North Central Region Water Network is an extension-led collaboration among land-grant universities in 12 Midwestern states, working to build capacity for effective decision-making on water-related issues. I'm Rebecca Power, Director of the North Central Region Water Network, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. The purpose of The Current is to increase access to university extension people, programming, and research that can strengthen water resource management in the Midwest. Although sometimes we make folks honorary extension for the purposes of this webinar, as you'll see in a minute. The format is 3 10-minute presentations with questions and discussions at the end. All webinars are archived on the North Central Region Water Network website at northcentralwater.org, and we'll give you that URL at the end of the webinar. Our topic today is farmer leadership in watershed management, and this webinar is the 13th in our series. Our speakers today will be Lois Wright Morton from Iowa State University, talking about watershed groups as catalysts, intersection of science and values. Julia Olmstead from the University of Wisconsin Extension, giving us some early insights from Wisconsin's farmer-led watershed councils. And finally, our honorary extension person from the Iowa Soybean Association today, Todd Sutphin, and he will be talking about watershed planning from a farmer perspective. So why don't we just go ahead and get started with Lois Wright Morton, and because people are certainly our greatest asset here in the North Central region in addressing water resource issues, we're going to give you a pretty decent introduction to everyone here. Lois received her PhD in developmental sociology at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. She's currently professor of sociology in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Iowa State, and she directs the USDA NIFA Climate and Corn-Based Cropping System Coordinated Agricultural Project, which is a large project, as you can see there, involving over 140 scientists from 10 land-grant universities and USDA Agricultural Research Service in 9 states in the upper Midwest. Dr. Morton's area of research includes civic structure, social relations, and human dimensions of natural resource management, performance-based agriculture, agricultural environmental management in local watersheds, impact of long-term weather change on agricultural land use management, rural communities, and rural quality of life. As I said in the beginning, we will be taking questions at the end, so if you could put any questions that you have for all of our speakers in the chat box as we go along. Myself and Janice Kepka, who's helping to moderate today, will compile those and use them at the end of the session. So, welcome, and Lois, take it away.
Okay, Rebecca, thank you so very much. I really appreciate the invitation to talk about sociology, the science of human and social values and relationships, and apply it to farmer-led watershed groups. 10 minutes. What I want to do today is just give you a flavor of some of the science of watershed groups, and give you primarily at the end some resources that I think will be very helpful for those of you that are looking to put together or in the middle of farmer-led watershed groups. Okay, so Janice, how do I forward to the next? Whoa, I just met. There we go. Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is my first slide, and what I want to remind all of us is that sometimes that we forget that we as human beings have the ability to govern ourselves, to shape our watershed, and to learn from our own experiences and others' past experiences, both failures and success. And these land management decisions have effects on soil, on water, and they involve scientific facts, they involve human values, and they involve social norms. The picture that you're looking at you might say to yourself, well, we're talking about farmer-led watershed groups and we're talking about agriculture. So why would Lois even use an opening slide that's very clearly an urban cluster of houses alongside a river? And I think most of you can answer that question really quickly. Urban and rural landscapes are very, very closely linked, and what happens upstream affects downstream. And so urban and rural populations and how land is used, we're really in this together, whether we're talking about flooding that erodes the soil from agricultural fields and transported into streams, or whether we're talking about dissolved nitrogen, phosphorus that flows off fields into streams. It flows by urban places, or whether we're just talking about policy decisions. Most recently, America's Watershed Initiative gave the Mississippi River Basin, which is the 31 states, many of the states that those of you that are on today, a D+ for overall conditions in the water. And what they were looking at was abundant clean water, flood control, productive, healthy ecosystems, recreational opportunities, river transportation, our local economies. And while I'm just talking about the Mississippi River Basin, the Great Lakes Basin, which many of you are also, your land drains to that, faces really similar challenges. So when we think about farmer-led watershed groups and how we're encouraging them to make changes, it's pretty important to realize that it's not just the rural or the agricultural component of that we need to be thinking about. Okay. No, wait, I've done something wrong. Okay, there. Okay, thank you. Okay, the second slide here that I want to talk about is that my particular research is civic structure. It's citizen-led watershed groups and how they can be catalysts. And the foundation of this really is that watershed groups are civic structures where local knowledge, values, perspectives, all of these can be integrated with the scientific and factual information that's needed. Janice, I'm getting some funny feedback. Are other people also having that problem? Thank you. Okay, so civic structure of places really, it addresses the problems of public commons. We activate local knowledge and values, and we combine that with scientific processes so we can accelerate factual learning. The two threads that my science looks at really is our processes to mobilize a group of farmers and the role of educators and technical specialists in supporting and catalyzing farmer leadership. And one of the things that we need to look at is, or think about when you're thinking about putting a watershed group together, or whether you're encouraging them, is remember what the role of this particular watershed group is, and it's to activate and accelerate social learning. And the way that we do that is we create a deliberative space where people can come together and talk about the issues. We ensure that science and facts are inserted. This is an opportunity to listen to differing values and views, and it's an opportunity to negotiate shared problem definition, because if we have different views and different ways of thinking about things, those need to be negotiated and they need to be talked through so that we can actually move to finding solutions and increase the willingness to act. So what might be some of the overall goals of a farmer-led watershed group? I've identified what I think are three broad-based goals that a farmer-led watershed group might focus on. First one might be proactive, might be concerned about their existing watershed. There may not be any particular public announcement that we have a particular problem with this watershed, but wanting to protect it, whether it's a high-value fishing stream, trout stream, or whether we're using it for other important uses in the community. The second one, reactive, is the one that we most frequently hear about, and that's the need to actually respond to impairments to that watershed and to actually do some different changes on the land in order to address those. The third one that I think sometimes we forget is a preparedness for future conditions. And so watershed groups can deal with any one of those. This particular graphic, I think, is an important resource, and what I want you to look at, it comes from my colleagues, my social science colleagues and myself have written a book called Pathways for Getting to Better Water Quality, The Citizen Effect. And it's really a nice compendium of the social science of what we know about developing leadership, about dealing with conflict, about preparing our watershed groups to deal with certain relationships and to measure some of the involvement that they have. And so I would encourage you, if you're doing work with a watershed, to I think this book is available to the library, or you might check it out, because I think it really does have some, does inform some of the work that you're doing with local watersheds. Another resource that is very relevant to farmer-led watershed groups is the science of the cropping systems and the different practices that we're doing and how do they affect both water quality, the nitrogen, carbon, soil organic, carbon retention, soil erosion. And you'll see on this slide I've given you the website for sustainablecorn.org, which is our group of scientists that have actually the last 5 years been looking at the corn-based system and how we can make it more resilient. Okay, so one of the things that some of the work that I've been doing and that the Citizen Effect book has is this group effect. And the watershed, a watershed group really is making good use of our own experiences, observation of others, and conversations with others. And the role of an extension educator or technical specialist and our community leader is to facilitate this intricate feedback loop among human and natural systems and increase some of the beneficial outcomes that we're looking for in terms of being concerned about water quality. There's a process, and I have 9 steps that I think a watershed group needs to pay attention to. If you're putting together a watershed group, identifying 2 or 3 core farmers with vision to do something different, expose them to science, create group public opportunities, and then agree on goals and outcomes that is looking at the community benefit. Then facilitate iterative learning experiences, identify a variety of solutions, choose indicators. As a group, once you've identified those indicators, monitor the activity, and then develop some adaptation practices based on that monitoring feedback. So these are really 9 steps of the process that you as a technical specialist or as an educator could be leading people through. Oops. Okay, and let me just give you my take-home points. Farmer leaders need the big picture. They need to think about these human relationships that are feedback loops of social values and how they're thinking about the issues that involve that watershed, and then combining that with science. Watershed management should account for values and facts. these group processes are really feedback loops that can influence the social learning that happens and the values that are linked together with this group. And then lastly, I believe that you've been sent a resource list that can identify some of the social science practices that might be of value to you as a watershed group leader or person that's thinking about putting a watershed group together. Thank you. My time is up.
Great. Thank you, Lois, very much. And folks can, if you have questions for Lois, please put those in the chat box. Again, we'll be harvesting them to ask after our other two speakers are finished. So the other thing I wanted to let folks know about, which is up here on your screen, is we are asking you to take a very short survey, just a few questions, 4 questions that will tell us whether this webinar was of use to you, and if so, how. So please, before you leave, if you could just go to that link, which is also in the chat box, so you can cut and paste it. But we're not done. So Lois has given us some of the social science research foundations behind the potential for strengthening farmer leadership in watershed management. Now we're going to have a couple folks working in the field to get this done. So our next speaker is Julia Olmsted. And Julia has been with the University of Wisconsin Extension since 2013 as coordinator of the Farmer-Led Watershed Council project. Previously, she was a senior associate at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She has a master's degree in plant breeding and sustainable agriculture from Iowa State and a master's in journalism from the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's degree in Spanish and botany from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, Julia, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, everyone, for having me be part of this webinar. I hope that you can all hear me okay. Let me know if you can't. So I am going to race against the clock here a little bit to tell you about our project, who we are, how we got started, and some of the insights that we've discovered over the last 2 years. And like Rebecca said, I've been with Extension since we launched the project in early 2013. So we are just over 2 years into it. So we are, you know, these things take a long time, but we're you know, kind of into the thick of it at this point. So our project is here in Northwest Wisconsin. My office is in River Falls, and we have 4 watersheds that we work in. They are around the HUC 12 scale, and they range from about 12,000 to 20,000 acres. For those of you familiar with Wisconsin, they're in Polk, St. Croix, in Pierce County, that's in the St. Croix River Basin, and then over in Dunn County, which is in the Red Cedar River Basin. And of course, the genesis of our project is the phosphorus impairment in both the St. Croix and the Red Cedar rivers and the TMDLs that exist there. And these aren't new problems, but we really needed a way in the state, a new way of addressing the problems, because a lot of the efforts that had gone on hadn't really seen the reductions in phosphorus that anybody wanted to see. And so really, Lois's book, the Pathways book, I highly recommend it. It was a big inspiration for this project, and specifically the work of Iowa State Extension in the Hewitt Creek watershed with their farmer-led councils were also models for how this project was created. And the premise is really that civic engagement, like Lois said, and putting farmers in leadership roles can create sustainable, long-term, and hopefully more effective improvements in water quality outcomes. Our project is not just UW Extension. It's a really great collaboration with a lot of groups. We get a lot of resources, both monetary and staff time from the Wisconsin DNR. We are very closely working with the land conservation departments of the counties that we're in. Those are sort of similar to the soil and water conservation districts in other states. And then the Wisconsin Farmers Union is a strong partner of ours, as well as serving as a fiscal sponsor for some of our external funding. I wanted to show you a little bit about the watersheds where we work, even though that looking at it from the state wide level, they're pretty proximate geographically. They're actually pretty different in a lot of ways. This is the watershed we're in Dunn County, the Hay River watershed. It's our hilliest landscape, and that means that the farms are not quite as good for growing corn and soybeans, so we have more diversity with crops and livestock, with smaller farms, and it's a less affluent farming community. Over to the west in Polk County, that's a little farther north. It's flatter. It's better for growing corn and beans. So we have bigger farms and less diversity. Down to the south in St. Croix County, it's sort of similar to Polk County, but even flatter, a little bit better. So we have even bigger farms, bigger land holdings, and some pretty large dairy operations. And then down in Pierce County, the South Kinney watershed, which is just south of River Falls, we grow a lot of corn and soybeans there, but because it's close to the Twin Cities, only 30 miles, and because we're close to the university community, there are some smaller farms and a little bit more diversity there as well. Our budget, we have from DNR $100,000 a year for my position in the project expenses. We get $100,000 a year from the DNR also to go to the counties for their staff, and they match that. The counties do. Right now we get $50,000 a year from McKnight Foundation, and that goes toward our farmer-directed funding, which is primarily conservation incentives. And then we have recently gotten a $25,000 SARE partnership grant for on-farm cover crop research that we're pretty excited about. So I want to talk now about some of the insights that I have noticed over the last 2 years, and these are anecdotal observations, and if any of my colleagues are on the webinar, they might be able to chime in later on in our discussion about things that they've noticed as well, but I was hoping that these things would both be beneficial to people who are thinking about starting watershed groups of their own, and also just to prompt some discussion and questions. So the first insight is that some watersheds may have inherent advantages or disadvantages, and I realize I probably should have written all watersheds will have inherent advantages and disadvantages, because I think that's pretty obvious. But of our 4 watersheds, overall our project has been going really well. One of the watersheds is not working well. We've had a really hard time getting a lot of buy-in and just investment from the farmers. And one of the things, or a couple of things I think are reasons why. The first is that it's the watershed where we have the largest scale farms. So these farmers have, almost all of them have really large land holdings. They're very leveraged when it comes to planting or harvesting. They're really busy, and I think they don't see that they have a lot of time for activities that require the investment that our project asks of them. Geography is very homogeneous, and I think in terms of the agriculture production, and I think in my guess that I think that creates sort of a limited imagination about the kinds of change that are possible, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that it's harder when you don't see other people doing different things to really imagine that you could try something else. There's another extension project that's already existing in that watershed, and they have a different model for engagement than we do, and I think that it's been a little bit of a challenge to try to relate to the farmers in a different way because they already have that experience and they're used to that. And so I think you need to be aware of other models of influence that are pre-existing in a community or in a watershed. The second insight is that water quality per se isn't the most effective motivator. When we started our project, we did spend a lot of time talking about phosphorus and about the ways phosphorus moves through a watershed and the impacts of agriculture and things like that. And then in the spring of 2014, we got massive amounts of rain in this part of Wisconsin and had really horrific erosion. And the farmers started to talk about climate change and the impact that that was having on their farming systems and what it would mean in the future. And that was a pretty new thing for us to be talking about. And they asked for us to bring in somebody to speak about climate change. We had a fantastic extension climatologist from Minnesota come over, and we also talked about soil health and how soil health can maybe be a buffer to help with some of the changes that climate change is bringing. And that was a real important moment where we realized that soil health is a very positive frame to talk about how you get the changes that we want to see that are going to lead to good water quality outcomes. And since then, we have really used that as our frame primarily. So we do still talk about water quality, but we talk a lot more about soil health than we initially thought that we would. Insight number 3 is that monetary incentives are less important than we thought. We, like I said, modeled our project a lot on the Hewitt Creek Farmer-Led Watershed Project, which has had tremendous success and something everybody should check out if you haven't already. And they have a pretty cool program where every year they offer small incentives for farmers to either try new conservation approaches or to sort of bolster or encourage them to continue doing good practices that are demonstrating success. We thought we would do the same thing, and in fact every spring, twice now, we've offered these incentives. What we found is that it's been more challenging than we thought to get people to take our money. And we've had more interest in our field days that the farmers have put together and in other outreach and learning sessions than we have in the incentives per se. So that's been pretty interesting to us. I will say this is like Lois pointed out about core farmers. I think that's incredibly important, that you need early leadership development and establishment. You really, really need to be successful to have at least one, but preferably 2 or 3 farmers who are ready to commit, have a vision, like Lois said, and are ready to really make the investment and put the time in to keep the group moving along, because you will have ups and downs, and people's interest that are not part of that core is going to wax and wane, and you really need somebody that can help pull you through. And insight number 5, and this is probably the happiest one, is that farmers really do value this project. We had some rough patches here this year with the Wisconsin state budget, and a big part of our funding was cut, and it was not clear whether we'd be able to continue the project or not. The farmers launched an incredible advocacy campaign to get our funding restored, which it was, and that to me was one of the best indicators, I think, of the value that this project brings. So if you want more information, you can check out our project blog, and you can send me an email anytime or call me up. I'm always happy to talk about what we're working on. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Right on time. Great, we have her contact information there, and we'll also have it at the end. And thanks, Sheena, for submitting a question. We'll get to that at the end, and it's a good reminder for other folks that have questions for Julia or for Lois to go ahead and submit your questions in the chat box, and we'll bring those back around at the end. Okay, let's move on to our final speaker today, Todd Sutton. Todd serves as the Operations Manager for the Environmental Programs and Services at Iowa Soybean Association and has been on staff there for more than 12 years. In this position, Todd interacts with the EPS team on a day-to-day basis to plan and resolve challenges with project implementation and logistics, all that on-the-ground stuff that's so critical to getting the work done. He also provides oversight and management of watershed planning, assessment, and monitoring activities, outreach to producers and other watershed stakeholders, water monitoring design, installation, operations reporting, and watershed project implementation and evaluation. So Todd has answers to a lot of your questions. A native of Iowa, Sutton grew up in Des Moines metro area. He received his bachelor's degree in environmental science from the University of Kansas and a master's degree in land use environmental planning from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So thanks, Todd, and take it away.
Can you hear me, Rebecca?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Todd Sutphin. I'm the Senior Operations Manager for the Environmental Programs and Services at the Iowa Soybean Association. Today I want to talk about watershed planning, farmer-led perspective, and provide some examples of our work in this area. I think a lot of what Lois and Julia talked about will be relative here. So a little background, to provide a little background here. Our program was formed in 2000 by our board of directors as a way to kind of get ahead of the curve looking at voluntary approaches to conservation and farming. Our program develops tools and programs and services for conserving and protecting natural resources while helping farmers remain profitable and increase yields. Our program has 4 areas: environmental services. One of our foundational areas has been water monitoring and measurement. We have a certified lab. This year alone we ran over 4,000 samples through our lab. Provides excellent feedback for farmers and practice performance. We also have CCAs on staff that provide technical assistance, help farmers write nutrient management plans, conservation planning, work in field studies. The area that I came on board 12 years ago was the watershed services. So I've written quite a few watershed plans across the state to help groups with assessment, stakeholder consultation and facilitation, and project design. And lastly, our operations area. This is education and outreach. We can never disseminate and get enough information out into our farmers and stakeholders' hands. And we're involved in many leadership service areas. In 2013, state of Iowa completed its nutrient reduction strategy. This is a science-based framework for assessing and reducing nutrient loss from both point and non-point. The non-point or the ag community has a role in this. Non-point's a 41% reduction needed statewide for nitrogen and 29% for phosphorus. To fund some of this work, Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship developed its Water Quality Initiative program. The map to your right, there's some red and green watersheds. Those are the ones that are in the Water Quality Initiative program. The red watersheds are the ones that we're involved in here at ISA, doing such things as water monitoring, demonstration trials, communications, marketing, and outreach. One of the watersheds I want to talk about today is Rock Creek. Prior to it becoming a WQI watershed, we worked with a local district to help develop a watershed plan. It's a watershed located in north central Iowa. It's about 44,000 acres. And as Lois pointed out, we did follow, as we do with all of our plans, a 9-step EPA planning approach, where we did characterization of the watershed, stakeholder involvement. We're very big on creating farmer advisory councils. Again, in any watershed, you get who you get. And so, we have leaders to laggards, and so we identify those leaders, create a farmer advisory council, and then begin with goal development and the rest of the process. Oftentimes, when you're looking at setting goals, it often turns to water quality, but also maintaining productivity. So in this instance, we had 6 goals. 2 focused on nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as soil health, flood reduction, wildlife habitat, and aquatic life. This table that you see in front of you is from the science assessment that was part of the nutrient reduction strategy. It's something that we fall back towards when we discuss with farmers specific practices that could be implemented on the landscape and then their potential reduction, which is the column on the right. But oftentimes, when you're meeting with a group of farmers, it's always like, well, what practices are available? What can they do? What should we adopt? And so we have looked and turned towards this impact effort matrix tool, which is to help guide the group with conservation practices, which should be focused on in the watershed plan and then the ultimate implementation scenario. So this is actually a tool that was presented in the University of Wisconsin Office of Quality Improvement Facilitator Kit and can be found online. How it works is we run through the practices that were kind of listed in that science assessment. So there's a couple examples here: cover crops, bioreactors. The blue box kind of discusses or highlights the benefits of each practice. So it's a way to educate farmers and this Farmers Advisory Council on what practices are available and how they behave and how they perform. And so with this impact effort matrix tool that we use, farmers are then asked to rate the effort that they think it would take to accomplish an action, such as a pond. The effort could include components of installation, time, lost productivity, cost, maintenance, etc. So the sheet there on the right is the effort analysis. Each farmer on the council goes through this and ranks it. And then ISA staff then rates each practice its impact relative to the goal in the watershed plan. So the higher the impact score, the more benefit that the practice provides. So on the next slide here, so we rate the effort against impact and then make a matrix to begin kind of documenting or highlighting where those practices fall. So we have 4 quadrants. Practices in priority A, which would be the upper right corner, which we call the low-hanging fruit, are those that will make the most difference for the least amount of effort, at least as viewed by the farmers and rated against the impact. If you move over to the left, priority B, it's worth the work. It might be a little harder, more difficult, but the impact is there. The bottom right is quick hits. They're easy, but they may not have the impact. And then the lower left quad is priority D. We don't really want to bother with. But again, it's a facilitated process to help make informed decisions. The goal is to rate practices for both impact and effort. It kind of helps farmers decide where they want to land as it relates to practices. And we do this for each objective. So we've got one for nitrogen, we've got one for phosphorus, habitat, and so forth. And this is where we begin kind of turning the dials, as we like to say. It's a tool we've developed to evaluate practice combinations. So we've gone through this process, helped farmers identify practices that are available. They've gone through this impact and effort to help rank what they would want to try to do in their watershed, and then we start trying to dial in the numbers and the amounts of acres that we need of various practices. So we combine infield and edge of field. We bring in the nutrient reduction efficiency from that science assessment and begin trying to dial in how many acres we need of a certain practice. And this helps us determine implementation levels needed to reach our goal. Going through this process then, using a watershed spatial assessment data that we've done through characterization and assessment, we begin placing those practices on the landscape to achieve maximum benefit. And so this is an example of Rock Creek, of where we've got wetlands, bioreactors, nutrient management, and cover crops in a specific combination. Most of these timelines, as we all know, trying to reach our goals can be difficult. It's not going to happen overnight, so we really try to break it up over a 20-year time frame and then break it down into phases. And then try to fund those phases accordingly. Rock Creek has been very successful at going after funding. Like any active watershed, having a plan in place really helps it secure funding. And so they've received quite a bit of money here as of recently. Upon completion, they received a Watershed Protection Fund grant for nearly $1 million over 5 years. We've got some National Fish and Wildlife funds for about 50, and then they have become a Water Quality Initiative project for 3 years, and that's going to fund actually the installation of all 25 bioreactors and saturated buffers in one watershed. So we're pretty excited about that effort. Just about done here. Last slide, the last couple slides. We did have a social evaluation, a couple of them here. As part of the project, we had 2 surveys were used during the project. There was a general survey sent to 300 farmers and landowners. That was mainly to get some feedback about interest and understanding what a watershed is and that sort of thing. And then after completion of our project, we had another watershed evaluation done that was used to measure farmer and partner learning, engagement, and satisfaction. It was a nice feedback for us here at Iowa Soybean Association to make sure that we're connecting with farmers, make sure that we're providing the right information, and they're getting what they need. One of the things that we learned, one of the largest identifiable gaps, was the uncertainty regarding leadership within the watershed and future roles. It's one thing to come in and help a watershed group prepare a watershed plan. We can go through that process. We go through the impact and effort. We can identify where practices need to go. But then turning to implementation, especially when the funding starts to come in, who's going to do all that work? The question these farmers had was they were looking for guidance on how to form a well-governed watershed group. I think Lois touched on that a little bit. In this instance, one of the funding sources also provided a watershed coordinator. They still were a little concerned that the coordinator may not have all the experience, and so they also looked towards partnership development as being an important component of a well-functioning watershed, building strong networks with farmer leaders, agencies, extension, commodity groups. I think the successes in Rock Creek have been good. It's not fallen all on one shoulder of a watershed coordinator, but both the farmers and the local district have embraced the project, and it's doing quite well. And with that, in my presentation, I'll gladly take questions, and I've got my contact information here if you want to reach out and discuss more. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Todd. Okay, now we are on to the question and answer portions of our webinar, and Janice has put up the slide there with contact information for each of our speakers in case you would like to contact them later. We've also put up the survey information there again for you to just, it's just a few short questions to let us know how the webinar was working for you. Okay, let's start with our first question. What have you found is the best way to encourage leadership when farmers ask not to be in charge, but for you to do the work? And I think probably all of you could have some answer to that question. So I don't know, maybe we could start with Lois and then go to Julia or Todd.
Okay, now let me frame what the literature tells you, and then Julia and Todd can say what the reality is, right? One of the things that is really important when you put together a farmer watershed group is to recognize that they actually do need technical support. And lots of times in the early work that we did, sort of thought, well, we'll just find a couple of farmers and they'll take it and run with it. And it became very, very apparent quickly that they actually need technical support and organizational support. And so where that support lies is always the challenge. Julia's got some funding for that. Many of our watershed groups don't always have the funding for that, but it's a partnership. And Todd, you spoke about that too, about figuring out how that leader, those farmer leaders, what is it that they bring to the core group, and then what are the skills that they're missing, and then finding a way to supplement that.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Lois just said. I think that what we've found is that there is a lot of work that farmers don't have time for. That's really, I think, required to make these successful in the long run. And exactly what Lois said, it's technical support, and a lot of it is organizational support. Somebody to really do that facilitation and sort of fundraising, all of those things that take a lot of time and maybe are not skill sets that every farmer would bring to the table. That said, I think there are ways to continually cultivate greater leadership roles with the farmers that you're working with. And some may enter into the process thinking they don't want to be a leader, or they don't want to take on that kind of a planning role. And I think it's really a process of sort of being a good organizer and understanding the way that people what motivates people to be interested in something and what motivates people to be passionate about something. And so being very wise as to how you do that. What are the issues and the mechanisms that really get people passionate enough to take on those leadership roles. I think, like I said before, it's pretty critical to make sure that you've got some of that established as you get started. I think it's hard, we found, to go with a group that where nobody is really thinking that they might play that role, or nobody has the vision or the sort of that passion there in the beginning, even though there are absolutely, we've had farmers that have developed into those roles, but it's a tough road if you don't have anybody at the outset. I don't know, Todd, if you've had similar experiences.
Yeah, when we come on to a project, it's always interesting to see what kind of leadership you have at the watershed scale. We'll guide a watershed planning process, but oftentimes when we embark on a watershed effort, it's also kind of leadership by the willing. We'll find watersheds that have active leaders in there and rely on them, maybe not to guide the process, but to help us through that process. When other farmers see farmers attending, or farmer leaders can help bring farmers to the table, that really helps kind of solidify the process. Same with the local district. If there's comfort there with the farmers, that helps a lot. One of the things in the survey that we had learned about was that we led them through the process, and they developed some trust, and they looked to us for guidance. But the transition was always interesting. We're a statewide organization. We don't have the resources to stay in a watershed through the implementation process over the years, because we're trying to be involved in other projects. And so that's where that partnership piece comes in. The role of a coordinator that comes on board with a funded project, that person takes over the reins to help kind of with the day-to-day implementation of, let's say it's NRCS EQIP funding or some other type of funding. We still stay involved in field days and meetings, but I would say the day-to-day boots on the ground is extremely important, which is not only provided by that coordinator, but also the agencies and partners around. It's an interesting transition. I would say that the boots on the ground is one of the most challenging things that we have with watershed projects, because some of these coordinators are only funded for 3 years. But if you have a 20-year plan, how do you look at governance and implementation over a longer period?
Which is one of the reasons why you don't want to hang a watershed group on one particular charismatic farmer. It's super important that you have 2 or 3 farmer leaders that like working together. I mean, if you find one person that just has a really excitement and passion for doing this, you want to transition that energy by saying, okay, so who are 2 other people that you really like to work with that would help you form the core? And they almost become a leadership support group. And that helps you identify, one of them may want to be the spokesperson, but maybe the other one is the organizer. And so it's because part of a watershed group is about liking to be with the people that you're with. That's kind of one of the motivations of why any group is successful, is because you like being around those people. You learn things from them, and they're interesting. And so that's why a leadership of 2 or 3 farmers to start with that already have a relationship and have some trust can move a watershed group along a lot more quickly than if you don't have that.
Great. Here's a follow-up question. So, we have these state-level nutrient strategies in most of the states. For folks on the call, I think every state has priority watersheds that they're working in. What if you don't have 2 to 3 core farmers in one of those high priority watersheds? What then? Do you just go to a different watershed, or how would you work that?
That's a really, really tough question. Some of the work that I have has a readiness test that I always suggest that coordinators look at it. There's about 8 or 10 questions on it. That sometimes there's just a lot of community readiness, and part of that readiness is that you don't have somebody ready to step up. And until if you want to put together a voluntary farmer-led group, somebody has to be willing to lead, or there's not a readiness in that community. And so then that means the agency or the organization that's trying to implement that needs to find another way, and it'll be less bottom up, it'll be more mid-range or top down in order to do that. There's no easy.
I think that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think that you know, in our work, we have the way that we selected the watersheds wasn't necessarily looking at the areas of highest impact in terms of phosphorus load, but it was a combination of that with watersheds where we had identified potential leadership. And part of the reason that we did that was because we wanted to, you know, create conditions for success, and also because I think that, you know, if you're in that situation where you don't have those farmers, you don't have the pre-existing leaders, you know, if you're thinking about it a little bit more long term, you might be able to think, well, is there a community that's not too far away that does have that kind of leadership where we might be able to start something that could serve as a model and could help over time to influence a nearby community. You know, you might get a farmer that gets excited about something that's going on, or a couple of farmers that see what are happening, you know, in the community that you hope to target, and it might help you down the road with leadership development in other areas. But I agree with Lois that you really have to be careful and think hard. If you don't have those leaders already there, it's going to be a tough road.
Yeah, this is Todd. I like Lois's term of readiness. You know, you look at these priority watersheds, at least in Iowa, and you know, it's a target-rich environment, as we kind of jokingly say, in terms of looking for watershed projects. But it's also a readiness within, like a Huck 12. Do you have the adequate leadership? Do you have the interest? Do you have the motivation to do it? We'll often survey or work with a local soil and water conservation district and ask, you know, in this county, do you have areas that you have actively interested or farmers that are interested in leading? Which is one of the readiness things that we've used to help select watersheds. You know, in the early days, we've gone to some watersheds where it wasn't there, and it was a tough process because you just didn't have that engagement, and it was tough to get any traction to get the watershed project going. So. And I also agree that the more attention that's been given to nutrient reduction strategies, and here in Iowa, water quality is front and center. I think there's a lot more information, education, outreach that's taken place about the need for this type of work, and we're seeing an increase in interest across the state.
One of the very first things that a watershed group has to do is to identify the problem as to why they're even convening. And so if they don't see that there's an impairment, if they don't see they have a nutrient problem, it's very hard to mobilize them. And one of the really important reasons for this nutrient reduction issue, not only across the upper Midwest, it's just not just Iowa, it's all of our states, that nutrient issues are front and center and they're high profile. And while our farmers really don't like to be put on the spot, it is one of the things that creates a readiness situation so that they realize that, you know what, if I don't step up, someone else will, and I might not like the outcome from that. And that's an important readiness piece to leverage.
Very helpful. Thank you. Okay, another question here. What role does the watershed coordinator play in implementation?
I can take that one.
Well, I can. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be brief. You know, I kind of mentioned earlier that watershed coordinator is kind of the person that on the implementation end is the day-to-day type contact for the farmers. When you've got practice implementation dollars via an NRCS or somewhere else, there needs to be kind of that day-to-day one-on-one interface. And that's kind of that coordinator's job. Coordinate field days, work with farmers, you know, have face-to-face meetings. If they have questions that are beyond what they can answer, that coordinator can field them to folks like us or somebody else on one of the partners. But again, they're kind of the on-the-ground, day-to-day functioning person in that watershed.
Anything to add, Julia?
No, I mean that's that's a lot of the role I play. I have the luxury of having fantastic partners in each of the counties where I work who are either conservation planners or conservation technicians. So it comes to the actual nuts and bolts of some of the implementation, like of constructing grass waterways or things like that. You know, they play that very technical role that I don't play.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. You suggested, and I don't know whether the you is, I think it was Julia, it was the you suggested that there were several barriers to conservation practice adoption. Do you have any guidance as to how to remove these barriers?
Well, I'm guessing maybe it was Lois that said that, but I can talk about it too, because it's true. Well, I mean, that's the big challenge. That's what we're working on. That is the question: is how do we move those barriers? And I think you know, the primary mechanisms that we think work are for farmers to see other farmers doing it successfully. That's one of the reasons why we have our on-farm cover crop and tillage trials. Seeing something very local that works rather than hearing about it, you know, on the other side of the state is, I think, very powerful and something that appeals a lot to the farmers we work with. I think, you know, economics are really important, and being able to provide good evidence that something can be economically feasible or ideally profitable is really important. And I think there's just a huge cultural element that takes time that is a big part of what we're trying to create with the groups.
That was a good answer, Julia. Social science has a lot of research that we've done in that area with mixed results, and the barriers to conservation practice adoption are many. There's a sense of, you know, do people think there's a sense of risk? Are they worried about particular outcomes? But primarily, if they found a production practice that works and saves them time and saves them money, we just keep doing it. It's easier to keep doing what you've been doing than it is to change practices because of the time and money investment and skills that you need to be developed. So there's not just one single barrier. There's a lot of them, and sometimes they work together and they affect different people differently. But you answered that really well, Julia.
Yeah, this is Todd. I don't have much more to add. The barriers are an interesting discussion. You know, a lot of times it comes down to economics. I mentioned this effort, you know, how much time and productivity and maintenance it would take. A lot of times we ask farmers to make a change on their farm, and they're the ones taking all the risk. And so I think that's where the science and data is important. You know, how is this specific practice going to function on their farm? And what does it mean to their operation? We've really started to talk about profitability with farmers. You know, conservation can be profitable. You know, if we're looking at a farm that's continually losing money in a certain area, you know, maybe it is time to begin looking at a specific practice and then look at the economics behind it. But you know, Julia makes a good point that when you're talking about some of these practices and the barriers, you know, continuous conversation, education, outreach with the farmer is important to help them feel comfortable in making a change. And again, that's economics, science and data, it's cultural, it's all those. So that's all I got for that one.
And the idea of putting a farmer-led watershed group together is one of the strategies to reduce that barrier.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And one more question. Slash comment for Lois. You identified finding 2 to 3 farmer leaders with a vision. How do you choose them? Any more to say about how you would choose them? Are you looking with farmer with specific values? For example, a strong environmental ethic, person who has certain kinds of desired on-the-ground practices, or a worldview, you know, a farmer innovator. He says he's been recently introduced to the community minority literature that indicates a small group of people with strong beliefs are what drives social change. So any thoughts about those questions and comments?
Let me answer the second part, and then I think both Julia and Todd can really answer how they went about finding some of those farmer leaders. But yes, this notion of the committed minority in any social group that's charged with doing something. It really is a small group of people that are willing to act and change in any kind of a group that you're part of. And so, yeah, that's really good literature to explore. But coming back here to finding farmers with a vision, how do you choose them? Julia and Todd, why don't you tell us how you choose them?
I can answer that one. Variety of means. As I mentioned earlier on the readiness, we talked to the district conservationist or the local soil and water conservation district. They usually had 2 or 3, key farmers that were leaders. A lot of these farmers have adopted practices, maybe entertaining new things, trying new things. They are innovative. And we'd reach out to them and have some conversations about their interest. Would they be willing to serve on a farmer advisory council, that sort of thing. And it's interesting when you get to start talking with them, they might point out a neighbor or two that they're friends with or know that's active in the community or in the watershed. And sometimes our meetings would start out with only 3 or 4 farmers, and then we'd be able to maybe not recruit, but bring in a few more based on interest or recommendation. Some of the farmer leaders that we've identified have actually been Iowa Sweden members. So, they've been engaged that way, and then we kind of introduce ourselves and have that conversation. But we've really never followed any one pattern. It's usually just kind of identifying with the locals and kind of going from there.
Our process has been just about exactly the same.
And so it's about just building a relationship with the community, so you get to know the community and who's the people that people reputationally trust and believe and are willing to listen to.
Yep, that's right. That's right.
Great. Well, we are out of time. We have one more question here in the chat box. If perhaps you could just go ahead and answer in the chat box or follow up with Ann separately. But she says we are seeing increased amounts of competition among neighboring farmers. Do you see this as an issue as you try to bring together geographically close farmers to collaborate? So again, I just want to let folks know that that's a question out there. We don't have time to answer it right now, but Lois, Julia, or Todd, you could type something there in the chat box or follow up with Ann separately. Thank you everyone so much. Thanks to our speakers for excellent presentations. You will be able to, participants, you will be able to access this presentation on the North Central Region Water Network website, northcentralwater.org. And it'll take you to a YouTube site where all those are stored. Please take the time to use this link here, the gowisc.edu CPF 547 link, which is also in a number of places in the chat box there, to let us know if this webinar was useful to you and how. And we have our November 18th webinar, Innovations in Stormwater Education, coming up in November. So thanks again for joining us today, and hope to have you back with us again soon. Take care, everybody.